Let me start by introducing our guest today. Adin Miller was appointed as Los Altos Mountain View Community Foundation's third executive leader in January of 2020. He has guided the organization through a multi-year transition to focus more on addressing inequities, advancing social justice, and building community. Adin is passionate about helping others identify and amplify how they advance social good. Adin brings nearly 28 years of proven experience in leading nonprofit organizations to achieve their greatest impact and advance social change. Respected locally and nationally, he has held both executive and senior roles and served as a consultant for a range of nonprofits and philanthropies. He holds an MPA degree from Columbia, a BA from Brandeis, and a strategic public sector negotiations certificate from Harvard. A graduate of the Community Foundation's 2019 LEAD program, now Community Leadership Program, and a former board member of the Community Foundation, Adin lives in Mountain View with his wife and youngest son. The elder one attends college. He volunteers as a referee and referee administrator for the local American Youth Soccer Organization, ASO, affiliate in Mountain View, and serves on the boards of the Mountain View Chamber of Commerce and the League of California Community Foundations, and can be regularly seen walking and playing with his dog, Theo. You have Theo with you today, Adin?
No, he's actually has been walked. Normally, I would actually be walking him and listening during these calls. Sometimes you get me in the park asking a question.
We're thrilled to have you with us here today. We're going to start off with presentation from you, and then we'll move to audience Q&A conversation. Adin, please take it away.
That's great. Thank you. Hi, Daphne. Nice to see you as well here. Lots of friends here, lots of connections to the Community Foundation. So thank you for being here. I'll start off with a little bit of framing and sort of how we ended up with this this convening, and then dive in a little bit into some of the conclusions or perhaps lessons that we've learned from this. And where it points to for us in the future. So thank you, Kim, again, for the introduction and the opportunity to talk about this. Most people assume that a community foundation simply serves the community as a bank, as a community bank that actually holds donor funds and perhaps regrants those funds into the community. And I would say that we think of ourselves a little bit differently. We think of ourselves as a community asset, an organization that can help our community wrestle with and tackle the challenges that we face locally. And if you can go with that mindset, it sort of drives how we actually arrived at these convenings that we've now been running. When the foundation was established nearly 33 years ago, our anniversary is coming up in August, it actually first served a very sort of simple purpose along the lines of that community bank kind of approach. It was actually there to serve the needs of those who were trying to make planned gifts, and it was kind of transactional. But Roy Lave initially looked at that and then saw an opportunity to sort of morph the organization into something a little bit bigger and a little bit more impactful. He embraced this idea that the organization should actually be focused on community engagement. And you can see that in a lot of the footprints of the organization and what it's done over that time frame, whether it was actually creating and supporting the LEAD program, allowing Cafe, for instance, to become a project under the foundation as well, or finding other ways to actually engage community members in different issues. And I think that kind of approach has been a very core part of the organization's philosophy, very much grounded in some of John Gardner's writings as well. And so we've just sort of kept that moving forward and kept that orientation throughout our work. Prior to the pandemic, though, I would say, and I have some former board members who can actually attest to this as well, the foundation brought people together really more on a social and kind of celebratory kind of cadence. Our biggest event of the year actually would have been right around this time of the calendar, our solstice event, which was a great gathering. But there were also this understanding that the organization needed to move perhaps in a bit of a different direction. So part of its 2018 and 2019 strategic planning process identified that the foundation should put forth the idea that we should engage more residents in local issues. And we looked at that from the spectrum of how do we bring people to have conversations about different issues? How do we raise the visibility about different issues? How do we even just signal that there's something happening in our community that people should pay attention to? And that was also that predicated both the way we actually operate our grant making program, as well as how we actually line up different kinds of events and activities. Lo and behold, we had a pandemic that sort of put things a little bit on hold. And it's also right around the same time when I joined the foundation. I joined the foundation in January 2020. I believe I had about 7 weeks of in-person office time with my staff before we all were dismissed to go home. And it made the narrative about how we engage people locally a little bit more challenging. The pandemic was awful in many, many ways. And obviously, we saw many issues play out on the local level, on the national level, on the international level, and so on. If there's a bright spot in it, is that the pandemic also gave us a bigger runway to actually affect the changes that we were talking about back in 2018 and 2019. And so this orientation around shifting more to a social justice kind of focus, a little bit more focus on equity issues, was certainly accelerated by the pandemic. The idea of how we engage people in community issues also became more accelerated in that. And we were given the opportunity to sort of play around with that. How do we actually do that? So we started to evolve into bringing people together to discuss a few of the challenges we were witnessing on the local level during the height of the pandemic. The first part of that was actually sort of just bringing our donors together. I think I very clearly remember my first Zoom meeting with donors, where I actually was calling from or videoing in from Taos, New Mexico, because we had sort of seconded over there for a few weeks, and there were donors coming around the table, and it was kind of a social moment. People hadn't seen each other in person in months, and the ability actually to just have conversation and to hear a little bit about what the foundation was doing gave us a sense of there's something here. We can do something along these lines. This might be a question for you, Kim. I don't remember exactly the timing of when LACC started hosting its Zoom meetings. I think it was probably more along the lines of 2022, but I think there was a realization again that people could come together and have conversations online. We didn't necessarily need to actually depend on in-person interactions to be able to move that forward. So from that led us into this idea that in the following sort of fiscal year, that we could actually start bringing people together to actually have some information sessions. We did that periodically. We sort of identified an issue. We wanted to bring people together. We sort of tested the waters on that. And then I had this wonderful opportunity presented to me by a member of the Community Coalition, Marie Young, and then Robin Avers at the same time came to the foundation, came to me and asked, what about doing something on a more concerted series level? And from there, we birthed an ongoing conversation around the impact of the pandemic on women, with a particular focus on a different lens in that kind of exploration. So we were looking at it from the workforce kind of impact. We were looking at it from mental health aspects. We were looking at it from career development, and that gave us a great partnership with the Women's Caucus to do a deep dive into the subject. Where we challenged ourselves right at the end of that series was to try to understand in our last session and our last conversation, what were the policy implications? How do we, and we're having this conversation, we're hearing from different members of the community, people, some people, members in the community whose voice had not actually been elevated and heard very clearly up to that point. And we were wrestling with, like, what do we do with this? How do we actually get people to care more about this issue, to actually get involved and actually take some action on their own part, or perhaps raise some visibility on the issue and so on? And so that last session for us, which was probably, I would say, the hardest of the sessions that we did on the subject, was challenging in some ways, but also giving us, again, sort of a stepping stone to the next idea. by then, we were talking about, we're tail end of our 2022 sort of calendar. We were actually finishing our 2022 fiscal year, so right around, 2 years ago. At this point, we started thinking about what we would do the following year, and and at the same time, communities were coming back together into in-person interactions. There was a clear opportunity for us to actually move this conversation forward in a different way. And so we launched this concept of pulling together a conference, a policy convening for our terms, last year in May of 2023. And it was a little bit of a risk, here we are where, most people don't identify community foundations with this kind of work. We wanted to sort of test out the water and see whether or not there was an energy to bring people together to have conversations. There were certainly lots of subjects that we could talk about. Last year's, subjects naturally were identified through the conversations we've been having with community organizations throughout the year. And we got the sense that there was something there that we can actually do again. And so we decided to pursue this again this year. The policy convening was held just, I think, 2 weeks ago. Time is a little bit blurring at this point, but we hosted it at the Mountain View Community Center, which I'm happy to discuss why we chose locations and what that means for the future. We ended up having about 165 people registered for the session, which the year before we had maybe a little bit over 100 people registered for it. The active number of people who participated was about 125. We did have people flow in and out of the conversation because we started at 11:30 with an informal lunch. The formal program started at 12:30. The full program ended at 5. So it's a long afternoon if you're sitting there participating. So we did have some people who sort of flowed in and out of that. We did have some walk-ups. We had one gentleman who was running for his daily exercise and decided that, this is interesting. I have no idea what's going on. Haven't heard that. Went home, changed, came back, and sat in, which is, it's like, I love that story. It's like, that's a perfect analogy, like why we want to do this kind of things. And I think on the whole, we actually had a really interesting afternoon of conversations and deep dives into subjects. I see Brenda has joined us. She was one of my speakers on the panel that we organized. And it gave us, I think, a blueprint of where else we can go forward, and some of the conclusions that are now starting to emerge are sort of pinpointing some of the opportunities as well. So let me do a little bit about sort of the subjects and why we arrived at what we did, and as well, sort of like a little bit of sort of like the conclusions that were coming out of them. But on a higher level, I want to sort of mention the philosophical idea of why we do this. I started off by saying, most people identify community foundations as community banks. They're simply there to serve donors, resources, and put resources back out in their community. And what's happening in the world of philanthropy and community foundations is that there is an evolution for these kinds of institutions. Community foundations are grounded in the community that they serve. They represent usually a geographic area. Some cases they represent a community as identified by some other kind of construct, but for the sake of this example, let's just use geographic. And they've evolved into the point of understanding that there are things happening locally on the community level that don't just require grant funding. We've seen this metamorphosis around how actually communities operate, where I would say in the past, community vision was driven by, let's say, the government or elected officials. We've seen less and less of that emerging at this point, and it's creating this vacuum of where does vision come from in the community, and who can actually look holistically in the community and be willing to take risk and say, this is where we need to go, and not necessarily be restricted in some sense by either voter interest or particular corporate interests or other kind of interests. And so what we're seeing in community foundations is that most of them have traditionally been very neutral on issues. They don't take a stake on substantive issues. They don't necessarily flag things that are important to our community that need to be tackled. And that's changing. Community foundations are now more and more comfortable in getting involved in policy conversations, in many ways advocating for legislation, which is in this case a direct lobbying, engaging much more with political actors, elected officials and their staff, more willing to push on different sectors and different areas. So periodically we will push corporate sector, or periodically we'll focus on the nonprofit sector, and really identify where does the opportunity exist on the community level to actually bring along what we in our field we call systems level change, but really just sort of bring it along in a collaborative kind of process. And so yeah, that's a little bit of a change for community foundations. It's certainly one that is when you take a step away from that, it's really interesting to observe how people react to that. We've had really positive kind of reactions from people in our community, donors and non-donors, about how we are actually raising issues and taking positions on different issues. And at the same time, there's some pushback. Some people actually don't believe that the issues that we're standing for are the right ones. In some cases, other people wish that we were actually just neutral and not particularly kind of opinionated on anything per se. I don't think that's going to continue. I think that this evolution for community foundations will continue to move forward, and that they will continue to have this kind of very community-driven vision kind of process, and try to articulate and try to bring people together around those kind of opportunities as we evolve. So in many ways, the policy convening is a reflection of that. It was an opportunity for us to bring people together to collaborate with a broader community and discuss these kind of critical concerns. We really wanted to create an environment where policy is not seen as just the domain of elected officials, that we want to be able to have a voice in that process as community members. And we wanted to have the ability for people to walk into the convening, participate in a conversation, and feel like they were informed, and identify ways for them to become further engaged as well. So if you look at it from that perspective, when we start talking about people, when we started framing these conversations, we really wanted to intentionally not just have frontal presentations by panels. We wanted to bring the audience into the conversation, which is a little bit of a different kind of wrinkle on the approach. So a way for us to both educate, but act at the same time engage. We ended up having, members of the community, policymakers, professionals in nonprofit sectors. I think there was a little, small little smattering of corporate sector representation, and others involved, which is a great kind of sort of cross reflection of our community. We also had members of all three of our communities that we serve, Los Altos Hills, Los Altos, and Mountain View, participate in this. So it gave us a real kind of nice spectrum of representation. We had, knowing some of the people in the room, we had diversity and both who they represent, demographics. We also had diversity in socioeconomic status, and diversity in some of the perspectives as well. So that gave us a little bit of a nice kind of flavoring as well, and some intentional kind of perspectives that are a little bit different. The sessions themselves, we started off actually with a conversation around this idea of a philanthropist. I have this long time issue with people thinking that to be a philanthropist, you need to have a lot of resources in your back pocket. And I just think that is the wrong approach. To me, being a philanthropist means that you have a love of humanity, and that you can apply and deploy your resources however you see fit for that to bring your compassion and empathy to the community. And that means that you can actually bring your financial resources, but it doesn't have to be hundreds of thousands of dollars. It might be the $2 that Joe and I were just talking about before we launched the session. Or it might be a little bit of your time. I know Gary, for instance, he spends a tremendous amount of his time, right, volunteering in the community. That is a way to actually bring your philanthropy into play. In other cases, it's the network. I'm blessed to have a wonderful networker, Mike Kasperzak, who makes introductions nonstop. And that, again, is a way to be a philanthropist in order to help build community. And in some other cases, it's truly just bringing your talent, your ideas to the table. I'm blessed actually with Brenda actually raising questions to me periodically. It's like, oh, I hadn't thought about that. That is a really good idea. How can we do that together? Those kind of concepts. So when you think about the concept of being a philanthropist, we're trying to encourage people to think more broadly than simply how much money do I have in my checking account and how much money can I put in. I will say it would be great for people to put more money into community right now because it is just a slog right now. For the nonprofit sector, all across the board, fundraising is ugly. And before we launch, I was sort of giving in a quick update. David asked me, like, how are things going? It's like, no, we're down $200,000 year over year. It is just for us a real bad kind of fundraising result here. And we're not alone in this. And I think that's part of the challenge we're finding. People are stepping away not only from how they engage with their charitable resources, but also how they engage just in general. And so this was the idea, like when we started with the opening sessions, like we want people to become more involved, care about the community, to really wrestle with this idea of bowling alone and pushing against that concept of we're all operating in our own silos and not engaging on the community level at all. So I had my friend and colleague Adin from Silicon Valley Community Foundation share in a conversation with me. We sort of framed the conversation in a simple kind of back and forth dialogue. I felt very comfortable bringing Anne to the stage with me because we do this on a regular basis. We actually meet in other settings and have these same kind of conversations. And we wrestle with these kind of dilemmas. From that opening kickoff, we did our breakout sessions. We had a session on housing models for all, and a second session that ran at the same time, mental wellness. That was the session that Brenda spoke at. The housing model really brought together a cross kind of section of both people involved in housing from an official capacity. So, Wayne Chen, for instance, from Mountain View, as well as practitioners who are actually out there sort of looking at it from their advocacy kind of perspective, as well as sort of the nonprofit and community perspective. And in the case of the mental wellness panel, I potentially tried to bring together two different kinds of perspectives. I wanted to focus on our aging population, and I wanted to focus on the youth population. And it was fascinating to see the intersections between the two. Most people don't think there's an intersection, and there is absolutely an intersection. The issues that our youth wrestle with are the same issues that our seniors wrestle with. The loneliness is not an age restrictive challenge. And sort of like tackling that and sort of having conversation about how do we actually even just bring people together was part of the sort of the result from our breakout session there. Our second set of roundtable conversations will focus on economic vitality. We were really looking at it from sort of workforce development kind of questions. And then the companion panel that was running at the same time was focused on climate change and adaptation, which, interesting enough, was moderated by the mayor of Mountain View, Pat Walter. So, Jonathan, I think I missed an opportunity to have you moderate a panel. So maybe next time. And then we close with a coming together of how to actually move ideas into action. One of the exercises we asked people to do when they reconvened was to actually put down on these note cards that we had produced their own personal ideas of how they actually want to move into action. We are in the process now collating that and then be able to report back to our community about what we've observed, what opportunities are out there, and how people can actually connect with each other on those kind of action steps specifically. I'll close a little bit with sort of like, some of the observations that we found. And probably the biggest one was that when we designed these sessions, we really looked at the policy implications. Policy is hard for people to define, and policy often is an area where people look and say, how do I get involved in legislation? And that's not necessarily everything you need to do, or that's not everything that's available to you. I think in some cases, people, when we started these conversations, people recognize that for them, identifying opportunities, even just to engage with their neighbors about things that are important to them, and then find a way to raise that as a voice might lead to a policy idea that then actually has an opportunity for other people to get involved. And that's how you build community. People come together. So that was, for us, a little bit of a reinforcing kind of idea. The other one, which continues to resonate with us, and we're trying to understand how we can actually better allow for this to happen. I named 4 issues that we were doing in breakout sessions. And yet those 4 issues don't operate in isolation. So for instance, when you talk about economic vitality and workforce development, if you actually want to develop a workforce, and I've had this conversation actually even with the head of Canopy yesterday. If you're focusing, for instance, on building a workforce development program that's actually that supports environmentalism, gives opportunity for people to learn how to, let's say, take care of trees in our community, how to build better canopy structures, and so on. It's not just simply you need to offer the opportunity for them to have those employments. You need to think about all the other issues that touch upon them, whether it is transportation to work sites, whether it's educational opportunities, whether it's frankly food subsistence. Do they have enough resources for food and shelter and things along those lines? And that resonated. We kept hearing that in different pockets, and we need to be able to sort of figure out how do we, as we dive into one specific issue, how do we pull out and say, okay, and what are the circles that touch upon what are the issues that touch upon this particular issue? How do we actually work not just in silos, but how do we work on a much larger kind of platform to be able to tackle these kind of issues, so we can actually circle back to the main reason when we do this, create some systems level change in our community. How do we bring about a different kind of environment? Where do we go from here? We launched our new logo and branding at the site, so we'll start there. We're in the process of sort of ideating on this and trying to understand what issues emerge and how we actually position this for next year, which we will do again. Candidly, I would love to be able to take this convening and actually have it rotate through the 3 cities that we serve. One of our challenges, the reason why we ended up at the Mountain View Community Center again, is because we couldn't get the Los Altos Community Center for the space and for the time that we needed. And so we need to rethink like how we are, one, when do we actually ask for a space? And 2, how do we actually, if we can't have that space, how do we actually reconfigure it in such a way that it actually works effectively to be able to host it in Los Altos? I started a conversation with Foothill College, and just to see if there was an opportunity to do it there. Los Altos Hills lacks a community center, as they remind me often. But there's perhaps an opportunity to do there, and I'd love to be able to see how we can actually bring the 3 communities together as hosts. There's also this emerging idea that our government leaders actually would like to actually have a platform. One of the beautiful things that happened in our lead last year, our lead class, was we brought the city managers together for an informal conversation with the lead class at that point. And it was great to see them actually interact with each other and sort of play off of each other at the same time. And so I think there's interests on the staff part to actually have either an opportunity to have conversation with members of the community that they don't often get to do, or to bring forward an idea or 2 that they actually would like to prioritize and get some input on at the same time. And I think that's the beautiful kind of opportunity here. This is malleable enough that we can actually evolve it into something that works well for others in our community. The last sort of concept for us is like, how do we amplify this? How do we actually bring more people in this? How do we actually still tackle this idea of moving people from ideation into action. Frankly, how do we track it? How do we know we actually made a difference in that conversation? Is one of our internal challenges. How do we know that the conversations that we've had were effective in that way? But that's for next year's plans, and when we get to our fiscal year end, June 30th, we'll take a little bit of a breather and start that in July. And with that, I turn it back to you, Joe, or Gabe.
Thank you, Adin. Very informative. Thank you so much. I have just a few questions. I'd like to open it up for others so we can have a conversation here. But I really appreciate the great work you're doing. And my first question was why you organized this, and you did a great job of answering it before I could even ask the question. Um, were there any policy recommendations that came up that surprised you as a great idea that you hadn't heard before?
Surprise? No, I think what we're seeing is policy recommendations that people have been sort of trying to get more visibility on. I mean, so for instance, the regional bond measure to support housing has been getting a lot of attention, but I just don't get the sense that people in the general public understand that there's something going on here, and that there's fundamentally might reshape the way that cities actually finance their housing, element plans and stuff like that. And so I think from that perspective, there's I think more opportunity to educate members of our community about policy opportunities. I think that, in some cases I sort of alluded to this kind of cross-sectional idea of like, if you're actually looking, again, at sort of workforce development, you can't do it in isolation. How do you actually marry it with some other issues? And I think there wasn't necessarily a policy recommendation that emerged, but more of a challenge sent back, like, how do you do this better? How do you actually think about it so that it's not just siloed?
Okay. Do you think any of the recommendations are low-hanging fruit that could be implemented quickly?
I'd love to see the regional bond measure get some traction. That one for me is, I think, it's an easy one for the community members to sort of get engaged. And I do think there's some others that are actually worth exploring. Are they easy? I think the answer to that right now, Kim, is no. We did this 2 weeks ago. A week later, I was in Sacramento. I spent a day lobbying, legislators, and then 2 days hanging out for a conference with the League of California Community Foundations. So that was last week, Thursday and Friday. And Friday was the budget release. And when you come out of it with nearly 30 billion as a deficit on top of what has already been done, I think the appetite for municipalities in the state to actually tackle new ideas is very, very limited. And that was sort of the consistent message that we were receiving when we were talking to legislators as well. It's like, great ideas, but right now we have no budget to do anything. And so I think some of this might be, we need to figure out more nuanced ways to actually sort of identify what's easy hanging fruit, low hanging fruit that we can sort of pick, and that we should probably be laying the groundwork for when there are budget surpluses again to actually really intentionally move into those kind of opportunities. This is a little bit along the lines of when you think about how community activism happens, there's a period of dormancy and then there's opportunities. And in those periods of dormancy, the community activists are still planning. And that's what I think we should be doing at this point. We should really start intentionally identifying where are those things that we can actually advocate for. So, waiting for that moment where we actually have more robust budgets that can actually come online.
Okay. And finally, if you had a magic wand and could implement just one of the policy recommendations, which would it be?
I go back to my own personal issue, which is mental health and wellness. My magic wand would be costly, but I would embrace it. This is a little longer answer, so I apologize. When I look at mental wellness in our community, there's several different facets, but one major one, which is the stigma that people associate with mental health. And I would like us to be able to run a public health campaign to destigmatize it, to really intentionally provide people with a change in attitude. So that's based on the idea of providing knowledge, then changing the attitudes in which then change behaviors. That's really from the social sciences kind of approach. This was the lessons I learned from tobacco control when I was working at a foundation that fought the tobacco industry, of how you change adolescent smoking behavior, for instance. So if we want to actually encourage people to look at mental wellness as mundane as going to your hairdresser or to the doctor for just your annual physical, that it's perfectly normal to actually go sit and talk to somebody, or to explore other ways to deal with mental wellness challenges, we have to be able to change people's knowledge and attitudes about that to affect behavior. And from my own experience, those kind of public health campaigns cost millions of dollars. But I would love to be able to see that happen on a local level. I'd love to be able to see that happen in multiple languages. I'd love to see that tied into services that expand beyond what we have right now. And I'd like to see us be able to lower the barriers of entry for those who are not able really to seek that kind of assistance on a sort of ongoing basis, whether it's because this gets into those silos, transportation issues, or just simply even the cost of being able to enter into the system.
Good, thank you. I'd now like to open it up to attendees for questions. Please raise your virtual hand. I'll call on you. Remember, one question per person and no speeches. Gary.
Hi, Dean. Good to see you as always. At the convening, which was 2 weeks ago, how time flies, there were so many topics I'd love to talk about, but one in particular right now I'm going to bring up, which is about housing. We have a person at the History Museum, Diane Holcomb, who is going to lose her ADU in about 3 months. So we need to find a new home for her, or we could lose her. She doesn't have enough money to spend $3,000 a month on a home, a rental. So how do we go about doing that? We need some community foundation that can have a place where we can find access to available properties. Daphne Ross is on the line here, and so she's heading up the Affordable Housing Alliance. And this is a challenge to try to just find out what's out there.
By way of ADUs, yes.
Yeah, in particular.
Like what? I think so. So I'm sorry. Well, for one, I'm sorry to hear about the challenge. That's not an unusual story and very unfortunate. Here's how I would tackle the issue, not having thought really about how do we advertise ADUs, but I would start with an opportunity to look at a partnership between the government, because I assume they've approved the constructions of ADUs, so they actually have a list of who actually has that in place. I would then.
I talked to Nick Zorn, and he
Yeah.
says, I don't see anything available, but that's not the process.
No, I mean, you start with your inventory, what's there, right? And
Yeah.
then I would actually, try to figure out if there's a way to bring in the real estate companies locally as well. And see if there's a way to build a partnership between, again, what you're trying to do is you're trying to build partnerships, right? So if you can look at all the companies or institutions that actually have a role in this kind of transaction. So you're talking about government, you're talking about local resident kind of listservs or neighborhood associations. You're talking about real estate companies who might actually have some kind of insight. And if you can actually bring those three together, a nonprofit perhaps can serve as your repository for information. But if you actually come together and say, here's all the inputs, here's what's available, and craft a different kind of way for people to understand the inventory and the opportunities, then maybe we can get somewhere. But right now you're basically, you're in a cave, black cave, trying to find your way out of it. It's without that information, it's kind of hard to
I've reached out to so many different people. Erin Green with the school district, of course, she struggles with the same thing. I've reached out to real estate companies, and we found one that was going for $3,000 a month. That's just out of her reach. I know what she gets paid.
Yeah, no. So so Gary, I'm not going to answer your question direct. I mean, I'm going to pivot the question a little bit differently because I want to circle on one of the issues here. You're dealing. I use sometimes the phrase this upstream and downstream phrase. You're dealing with the downstream issue, which is compensation for the employee, lack of inventory, lack of housing, affordable housing. Right. Those are all the downstream issues.
Okay.
And what you're looking for is a solution about where can I actually find a way that actually allows this person to move forward. So it may not be an ADU, but maybe it's actually a room within a building, a house, or an apartment, or something else. Like we just have to think more creatively about what home looks like. The upstream issue is that when we look at the totality of who is actually living and working in our communities, they can't afford to live here. Their compensation is not high enough to be able to afford to live here. And we're losing talent all the time, right?
Yeah.
We lose talent when people decide they want to move into the nonprofit sector or they want to move into a startup kind of an idea. They put in maybe 10 years worth of time here on meager kind of resources, and have reached the point by the time they're perhaps in their early 30s, like, I want to be settled. And right. And I want to feel grounded in my community. And if I can't actually afford to live here, then I have to leave. I either have to find a different sector to work in that's much more for, higher compensation, which means I'm no longer in my passion area, but I'm just doing this in order to get compensation, or I move somewhere else altogether and, to a much lower cost environment. And I think that's the conversation we've been having in the philanthropic sector. What do we do for those kind of professionals who are in our mix? Can we find either, tax credit opportunities that actually will help them stay here? I play around with the idea of can we take the concept of parsonage, which does everybody know what that is? Like, yes, no. So think about your clergy. They get a tax break.
Okay.
Right. And it's covered by their employers in order to be able to actually afford to be able to purchase real estate or housing and things along those lines. That's a federal tax code. Why don't we have that for the nonprofit sector, which is never going to, match the resources of a corporate sector job?
Good idea.
Maybe that's a political kind of solution, a policy solution that can actually help us, or do we build a fund that actually has dollars invested in it that we then invest in these professionals so they can actually afford to live here? That's not going to solve your problem in the immediacy.
In the next 3 months.
Right. That's the challenge I would look at, like, how do we actually address this on a community level?
Thank you.
Thank you. Richard, you have your hand up.
Well, first of all, the conversation on rent is very interesting. I think you could put together a team of people and come up with some ideas and some partial solutions. But my question is, why do you think that donors are stepping away or maybe stepping back at this time?
Great question, Richard. I wrote a draft op-ed on behalf of Silicon Valley Foundation leaders that we're currently sort of editing, I would say, put it gently. Partly because we're looking at these kind of scenarios where we're seeing so much downward pressure on the nonprofit sector. So donor behavior for the past 2 decades has actually been trending downward. We used to have nearly 30% of people donate. We're down to, I think, below 20% at this point. And that's been a 2-decade slide that was only arrested by COVID. At the same time, and in that context, there's a number of variables. The number of people who donate is going down. The gift size appears to be going up, but it's because the high net worth, like the ultra high net worth donors, are actually giving more. So that's your Mackenzie Scotts of the world. If you take those out of the equation, gift size is going down. And then on top of that, as our society ages, the idea that new donors are coming in is actually not happening. You're not seeing as much new donor kind of behavior. We have more people who are willing just to simply sit on their resources and not actually engage with those kind of resources there for charitable contributions. So you've seen that one playing out across the board. You also then have to factor in all the other things that have happened over the past few years. Starting with 2022 when the S&P 500 dropped nearly 20%, and then if you factor in inflation, it was closer, I think, to 26% in value. That led people to take their resources and husband them much more closely. They were less willing to invest because they saw their portfolios decrease. I see this behavior, for instance, with my donors who have donor advised funds. They look at their account value and say, oh, I lost a lot of money in the account, so I'm not going to give now. I want to recoup where I was before I start to give, which psychologically makes sense. I recognize it. Intellectually, it's the wrong way to go, because at this point, those organizations that are actually being affected by that actually need the resources, and so we get into this kind of weird kind of dichotomy. The third variable that actually kicked in is inflation. The cost of operating a nonprofit organization has exponentially grown to the point that nonprofits are unable to, match the salary expectations of employees who actually look at, working and living here, to circle back to the previous conversation, and can't match that. And the donors are not matching the scale of inflation they're giving. And so now you create a schism, right? So if they're giving at the same level, I love my $10,000 donors every year, but inflation actually has taken that $10,000 donation and made it worth a lot less. My expenses have gone much higher. So those are three variables. There's a few others, including government funding and deficits and investment returns and things along those lines. But those you asked specifically, Richard, about individuals. So that's the scenario we're in. It's the word is just simply ugly.
Thank you.
Adin,
Sure.
any other questions from the attendees? Adin, do you have any questions for the attendees?
So I would love, some feedback, like if you were there, great. If you weren't there, what would you like to see next? I mean, what kind of conversations are emerging for you that you actually think are important? I mean, Gary, I noted your question, so I will hold that for myself, but I'd love to be able to see what other things are you seeing on the community level that you think warrant conversations and attention.
I can say something.
Annabelle, you had your real hand up, and then I'll go to Gary.
So my real hand. Yeah, well, Adin, we just finished our third focus group to develop the Age-Friendly Cities Action Plan for Los Altos. And as I'm doing the data analysis on that, and as soon as that's done, we'll make sure you get a copy of it. So that'll give us an example of low-hanging fruit. But one thing that comes up over and over again is older adults don't feel prepared for emergencies of all sorts. They're just don't know what to do. What do I pack? Who do I talk to? That kind of thing. Just emergency preparedness. And it's not just earthquakes, it's now smoke. People are very concerned about smoke and fires. So that's something to add to the list in terms of kind of a citywide attempt to be better prepared around emergency preparedness.
That's great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Not great as an issue, but great suggestion.
Yeah, Gary, and then Mike.
I'll let Mike go first since I have already had one shot at it.
Thank you, Gary.
Thanks, Gary, and great to see you, Annabelle. So, Adin, one of the things, especially about the community convening, is the presentations, the panels are great, but there is really limited opportunity for engagement of the audience, even in the breakout sessions. I know the ones I were in, there was time for about 3 questions, and they really are questions and answers from many members of the panel. So not as much discussion and engagement. So just something to think about. I wrote that in my survey as well. but try and engage the audience more somehow. Not certain how, but that would be a big suggestion for both this and the previous convening. You know, almost like, have you been to the civility roundtables that
Yeah, no, exactly.
the Relations Commission has done?
Yeah.
So
so it's
that sort
the
of has a
concept of actually
better
having people
breakout
sit,
session.
Yeah, the concept of we toyed around with this idea of like an open space kind of approach, or even just simply just putting questions on the table and having people sit at tables and just get into conversation with each other. It's a little bit more free form, which might be worth, we actually went a little bit longer in our policy convening, might give us the, an opportunity to play, let's say, a little bit more with some different modalities.
Yeah.
Back to Gary.
So I attended the climate discussion at the convening, and Pat Showalter, the one thing that she said that really struck me was about, she was focusing on sea level rise, and of course that's going to impact Mountain View. J.P. Renault from Canopy commented that, well, we've lost a fight against climate change. And so that stirred up some conversation. If by that you mean we'll never see 350 ppm again, it's probably true. We're well into the 400s, but Pat made the point that we're into the area of climate adaptation. And I thought that was a very useful conversation. And we did get some discussion amongst the panelists and the audience. So more along that line, I think would be appealing. There are things we can do, including plant trees.
Thanks, Gary.
No to climate adaptation. That's great.
Okay. And any other questions for the attendees, or questions from attendees for Adin?
I will note that there's an upcoming session that the Chamber in Los Altos is working on with one of our cities around the use of artificial intelligence and how that affects government. Which I think those are great, interesting subjects, and I'm not sure what the policy implications are yet in that, but I think there is something to be said about the conversation around the use of artificial intelligence and how we actually apply it in a lens around rebuilding democracy. David, this gets a little bit to your earlier comment about what we might be potentially facing. And there's something there that I think is worth exploring as a subject. So we might be stepping into that one.
Good. Last question, David.
Adin just covered it. That was exactly what I was going to bring up in front of the group. So
good. Well,
that's good, I guess.
Yeah. We're about at time. A few final announcements before we end at 9:30. Our next meeting will be on Friday, May 31st from 8:30 to 9:30 a.m. Please join us for a discussion titled Meet Sam Liccardo, Candidate for Congress, District 16. If you'd like to be added to the coalition mailing list, please send an email to info@losaltoscommunitycoalition.org. I think the email is posted in chat for your convenience. And finally, a big thank you to the Los Altos Mountain View Community Foundation for providing LACC with financial and in-kind support. Thank you, Adin, for the great discussion conversation today. We look forward to seeing you all in a couple of weeks. And have a great Friday and a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you.